Welcome to the Spy Who Raised Me podcast. Conversations between a daughter and her father. Yes, you've guessed it, he was a spy. My name's Jane Craigie and I'm here with my dad, Iain Craigie. And we are talking about Dad's time when he was in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. He was actually based in Jeddah between 1979 and 1980. We're going to start with a little bit of context to the region. So much that we're hearing about conflict in the Middle East stems back, as do many of these conflicts, many decades. And at the heart of it, back at the beginning of the 20th century, was the Ottoman and Arab conflict all over land. Steeped in this history is a man of myth and legend and history, Lawrence of Arabia. Dad, that seems like a fitting place to start. You know, you learnt a lot about the desert and you were there. Tell me a little bit about Lawrence of Arabia and why the man has context to what we're talking about now.
Yes, T.E. Lawrence was an unusual person. He was very fond of wild places and Arabs in particular, and he decided that he would go to Arabia and mix with and help the local Arab tribes in doing whatever they were doing. And they had a conflict with the Turkish army, which he over a period of 2 or 3 years he joined in as an active combatant, finished up as being one of the commanders of the army that fought the Turkish troops. And that fed into the First World War, where the Allies had a plan to secure access to the Bosphorus and through into the Black Sea, so that there would be a connection with Russia, who were one of our allies in the First World War. Now this was a seminal happening in that terrible conflict in Gallipoli, because Kemal Ataturk, who was the leader of the Turkish army, knew what was happening, and he very quickly set up a pincer motion that took him down into Gallipoli, where the high ground overlooking the Bosphorus Straits were ideal for repulsing any invasion that came from ships coming into that area. He very quickly set up trenches on the high ground overlooking the straits, and over a period of weeks he got his troops to dig trenches, secure all the high ground, and then he just settled there and waited for something to happen, which it did. HMS Clyde, I think, was the first ship that tried to take the Gallipoli Peninsula, but little did they know that the Turks were firmly ensconced in the trenches overlooking the straits. And when they tried to land on the Gallipoli beaches, they were decimated by rifle fire that killed so many people. It was unbelievable. And their organization, the Allies' organization of that incursion, was not well handled. It wasn't properly planned, and one of the commanders who was deployed to Suvla Bay, which is quite close to the trenches, instead of securing the land so that they could help repulse the Turks in the trenches, he decided that it would be much better to set up a control center so that he could sit there and organize his troops. Unfortunately, Kemal Ataturk had other ideas, and he managed over a short period of time after the invasion to move even more troops into the Gallipoli area. So it became a tragic episode in that particular conquest, and it finished up with thousands and thousands of troops. Australian, New Zealand forces were there, very courageous people who lost so many people, and the other allies. So that was something that goes down in history as being poor planning and vision by the politicians, especially Churchill.
And against a leader in Ataturk who was a famous tactician and strategist.
Yes, Kemal Ataturk was an incredible person. He was single-minded. He was different. He had this idea that Turkey, as it became, should be a secular state and should not follow strict Islamic rules and so on.
Which was very visionary for that time,
Very
beginning
visionary,
of the 20th
very
century.
Visionary. And it's odd now that that modern Turkey has gone away from that with Erdogan, and they're now looking at a much stricter Islamic situation.
So it's so relevant to today, isn't it? What's going on in that region? One of the things we will cover in a future podcast. Anybody who listened to the first podcast would have heard me say just what an adventurer my dad is, and where he took us on holiday. And one of our holiday destinations we'll cover in another podcast was Gallipoli, and we used to go there, and you could still find old guns and hand grenades and all sorts of things on the beaches. As children, we'd dig in the sand, find these things. But that's not for now. We'll come back to that in a future podcast. And Dad, at the end of the First World War, there was a huge task of splitting the various land areas between the Allies and the French, who were very interested in taking control, understandably, in that part of the Middle East. And that was really, you described earlier, that was really the beginning of Sunni-Shia fracture. So just to give you a little bit of context, the Saudis were Sunni, the Iraqis also Sunni, Iran Shia, the Syrians were Hashemite, and the Yemenis, the Houthi, were Shia. And that's the beginnings of a lot of the conflict that we're seeing today. And just to overlay that, so when the land masses were being split at the end of the First World War, in 1920, Syria was taken over as a French colony, and out of that they carved Greater Lebanon. Cover that in another podcast, a recent visit to the Lebanon, but that you see the French presence still very much in Lebanon today. And the Allies were granted control of the Ottoman Empire, the old Ottoman Empire territories of Transjordan, which is now Jordan, Palestine, and also Iraq. So if we fast forward to 1979, and you landed in Saudi Arabia at a pretty bad time, because they were celebrating, they were practicing Ramadan in Saudi Arabia. So you turned up there with 4 other colleagues. So there was an officer in charge, a man called Sandy Gordon, who was from Keith. There was an Arab linguist called John Morton, who was a very intellectual man, and there were 3 of you that were there as instructors. Yourself, Bob Davidson from Cooper, and Jordan Heisman from Cheltenham. And the 5 of you were there at the behest of the British government to train the National Guard, who were mostly Bedouin, and many virtually illiterate Bedouin, to teach them to set up their own intelligence service, which you'll go on to describe challenge given their lack of education background. So tell me a little bit about what you did, so what you faced when you first arrived there back in 1979.
Yes, it was an interesting mission we were given, because I don't think anyone had ever tried to teach Bedouin Arabs how to indulge in intercepts and surveillance. But we could see the need for it because Saudi Arabia felt threatened on a number of sides by the Yemenis, by the Iranians, and they had to, with all the resources that they had, the wealth that they had through oil mainly, they had to try and have a secure area that they could indulge in what they do best, and that is finding and selling oil to the rest of the world. But the Bedouin soldiers that we had, on the first day we arrived there in Jeddah, 1979, we were introduced to them. They were a motley lot. They all wore thobes, not uniform.
So describe what a thobe is.
A thobe is a voluminous white garment that men wear in Arab countries. Very loose fitting, very cool to wear, with pockets, large pockets either side, and we'll refer to that a little bit later. And so there they were, sitting looking at us. I think there were 12, I can't remember exactly how many. And we had to, through an interpreter, we had to introduce ourselves and give them some idea of what our mission was, which wasn't easy, with people who had been brought up probably in the desert, part of a nomadic group of people looking after camels. And we were talking about all sorts of things like satellites, like intercepting communications and so on. But anyway, they hung in there, and I guess over a period of time we did see some indication that they were absorbing what we were teaching. But as people, they were extremely kind. They were very hospitable. They used to invite the 4 or 5 of us who were instructing there to join them in the desert at weekends and meet their relatives who were camel herders. And that in itself was a tremendous privilege, to be able to join a culture so different from our own background. We, from a point of view of getting close to the people that we were teaching, it was great. But the fact that they had Ramadan and periods like that where they had to switch off, they would arrive in the morning after a night of fasting, and they would curl up underneath the desks and go to sleep, and then sit up for a while and then fall asleep again. So it was quite chaotic, the whole thing. And we discovered in Jeddah, Jeddah is it's a soulless place. It's all concrete buildings and not many people in the streets except for Yemenis who were the poor people that swept up and collected rubbish and so on. There were always 2 or 3 Yemenis scuttling about outside, but very few Saudis, because they were in cars with smoked glass windows and they were swishing around the city of Jeddah. But getting back to the students, we had one occasion in 1979. One morning we were doing what we were trying to do, that is teach them something. I think by that time we were covering satellites, just to give them some concept of what manner of communication might have to be looked at in the future. But all of a sudden, one of the group came up and said, "Oh, excuse me, we have to go. We have to go." No explanation. They just all walked out, disappeared. And we thought, what is happening? So we spoke to the interpreter and said, can you tell us what is happening? I mean, are they coming back? Is this the end of the story or what? And over a period of 2 or 3 days, news began to percolate through the media that the mosque, the Masjid al-Haram in Mecca, had been taken over by militants. Now, at that time, there were a lot of militants protesting against the Saudi government because of the policies of westernization. And the students, Jandis as they were called, were whisked off to help in evicting the militants who had taken over the mosque. So we got no news, and there was very little news, as is quite common in Saudi Arabia, of what was happening and what the militants were doing and what the Saudi forces were doing. But after about 5 days, all the students arrived back in the classroom, and they had pockets bulging with cash, absolutely spilling out.
So where had they got that cash?
They got that cash from the government through their army contacts and so on. And it was, like often happened in Saudi Arabia, people were given large amounts of money to keep their mouths shut, to comply with the very strict Saudi laws that they had, very secretive and not open to the outside world. So there they were, pockets stuffed full of notes, and they sat down. And when we tried to find out what the money was all about, they looked very sort of shamefaced. But we didn't really discover until afterwards, when the interpreter said, "Oh yes, that's commonplace when carrying out missions like that." But in any event, the mosque eventually, with the help of French and Pakistani commandos, reclaimed the mosque, and there were a lot of deaths among the militants. I think 67 deaths were posted up as having been the number of casualties, but we suspected that it was far more than that.
And you, as you said earlier, you spent a lot of time with the Bedouin. You got to know them well. You met their relative camel herders, and you spent time out with them in the desert, travelling with them in the desert, living with them in their shigs, which were their tents. And you were saying that they were made out of goat hair. And you were also telling me about goats being an important part of their culture, but also their food. And can you describe what a typical weekend was like out with kind, hospitable, embracing people in the desert?
Yeah, it was a great experience, because we were in Jeddah, which is on the Red Sea coast, and the deserts that their relatives worked in as nomads were about 150 kilometers away. So they used to roll up on a Friday with this huge Chevrolet, an American car, and Mohammed, who was the virtual leader of the group of soldiers we were teaching, he would drive, and he always stuck a tape in the cassette recorder, and it was more often than not pop songs that we got. And so we would go in 40 degrees up over Taif, and Taif in itself was a very interesting place, because at that time, 1979, they were still performing public beheadings and cutting off hands and so on.
Grief.
And as it happened, as we passed through Taif, Muhammad said, "Oh, these people are going to the beheading, and they apparently had a square, an open area where they performed these. And thieves had their hands cut off, one hand cut off. And for more serious indiscretions, they were beheaded. So that was was quite an event, I guess, in that society at that time, to go and look to see who was having their head chopped off. And it was an incredible. It was an incredible thing to be happening in a place where people were so hospitable and so kind. Anyway, we would set off into the desert and drive until we found the nomads, and there might be 20 or 30 or 40 camels there. And as Jane said, the black shig, which is such a fascinating tent structure, big, very heavy, because the goat's hair that was used to weave it was fantastic. And you would sit in there even when it was raining, and you would feel nothing coming through. It was just incredible. But the camel herders would come up and they would milk a camel. They'd milk a camel and offer all the guests a drink of fresh camel milk, and it was superb. So the main diet for these nomads would have been dates and camel milk, and the occasional hare or something,
and goat,
yeah. And the goat was another story, because it was such an interesting, the first time we went, such an interesting weekend, because when we got there and had said hello to the camel herders and had a drink of camel milk, they then dug a hole in the sand and put an empty oil can or an oil drum into the hole and set a fire in the base of this drum, and over a period of 2 or 3 hours they fed the fire until there was a nice even layer of white ash in the bottom of the drum, and then they put some green twigs on top, and then put the goat, which they had butchered and dismembered, on top of the green twigs, and put the lid on and covered it with goat dung and sand, and then they left it for a number of hours. And eventually, later in the day, they opened this up, and it was absolutely gorgeous. All these, and the smell of the goat was fantastic. And the tradition was that they cut a little bit of cheek from the goat and presented that to the guests. So you had to chew this slightly hairy piece of goat and swallow it, and then you were one of the clan, I guess. But no, very interesting experience, and one that brought everyone, I think, all our group, closer to the Arab way of mind, and it's so totally different to our own background that it gave us some insight into the culture and the politics and the geopolitics and so on. Very, very interesting.
And you learnt some Arabic as well while you were there, didn't you?
We went to the American school of where they taught Arabic and did some lessons. It wasn't wholly successful because Arabic is a very complex language, and we found the pronunciation and so on, the fact that we weren't actually using Arabic that much in the workplace teaching, that we didn't really do as well as we should have done, but so interesting.
Can you remember any? Can you tell us a little bit of
Arabic? Well, we used to pick up. They had terms, they had words that they used for greeting, and you would arrive and they would say Kef Halik, which is how are you, Kef Halik, and everyone would shake hands with each other, going around saying Kef Halik, Kef Halik, and this might take 2 or 3 minutes by the time everyone had got round, the neighbours, and what was the other words they used to use? Haram was often used, because haram is forbidden. So you can imagine in a society such as existed in Saudi Arabia, a lot of things were haram. And so if you did something or you said something, immediately you'd get someone saying haram, in a soft kind of voice. No, you can't do that. You can't say that. But again, coming back after all the farewells and that, coming away from the weekend, we would all filter back towards Jeddah. And I remember one instance where they had a friend who lived just outside of Taif. So they said, we'll go and see this friend of ours. So we turned up, and they had obviously they had forewarning that we were coming to visit them. So we came into this house and warmly greeted, and I said to Muhammad, who was more or less the leader of the group, is there a toilet? He said yes, and he pointed to the toilet. So I went in to the toilet, and I was surprised to see that it had modern fittings. The plumbing was all there. There was a bowl to sit on. There was a cistern of where the water should have been, and it was all there. So I had a pee and went to flush the toilet, and the whole damn thing collapsed. There was no water. It was all there for show, and and the cistern landed at my feet. And of course, my Arab friends were only a few feet away, sitting in the room next. So I felt exceedingly embarrassed when I walked back, and Mohammed looked at me and smiled, as much to say, "Well,
it's just part of the gig."
Part of the gig, those things happen.
And one of the people that you met, and we'll touch on this in a minute, but linked to why you were there. But one of the people that you met was the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and you told me a story about the vehicle that he used.
Yeah, it was. They had very unusual pursuits because of the desert, because of the nature of the country they lived in, mostly sand and volcanic rocks. And he loved hunting, and he hunted with hawk, which is traditional in Saudi Arabia, back throughout the Middle East. And on this occasion, he turned up, and we went to observe, see how it was done. And he sat on an adapted seat in the middle of the Range Rover. It was a big, opulent-looking Range Rover, and someone pressed a button, and he was elevated some feet above where he would normally sit in the Range Rover. And from that vantage point, you could look around, spot any hairs that may have blown the cover, and then he would set the hawk to kill them. He loved that sport. You could see that it was his passion.
And that takes me on to the strategic and relational importance of Saudi Arabia to the British government. It was obviously to do with power, to do with the British having some control, strong relationship with the Saudi leadership, and against a volatile place, a volatile area of the world. And how do you think the relationship came about between the British government and the Saudis for you to be there, training them in intelligence techniques?
Well, traditionally, I mean, like is now the case, oil and energy was a very big issue with all countries. For those countries who didn't have their own supply of oil, of course, it was an incredibly strategic thing to be able to buy a supply of oil, and that obviously gave people who had the oil wells great wealth and also great power. And in Britain's relationship with Saudi Arabia, there was always a balance between the need for us to get oil for the various things that required the use of oil, and our support of them, because the Saudis are very good business people, and they wouldn't give things away. So the equation was, we thought, and I'm sure it's true, that supplying arms, for example, to Saudi Arabia was one way of redressing the balance, even though we did pay a lot for the oil. But that, unfortunately, the Middle East being such a complex area, so many political and economic factors and geographical, that when the Saudis started attacking the Houthis in Yemen, and Yemen has always been a sensitive area for Saudi Arabia, because of course they're Sunni, and the majority of Muslims in the Yemen are Shia, and they've always felt threatened by them. But the equation now of Britain and other suppliers of arms like America and Europe to Saudi Arabia, who attack the Houthis, and there have been so many deaths in the Yemen. As a result of that, it is a very, very contentious point in modern politics, and one that hasn't been resolved and doesn't look as if it will be resolved.
No, and you were saying when we were doing we were having a conversation before we started recording, that part of your purpose there, so yes, you were there to train the National Guard in intelligence techniques, but part of the wider goal was to look at ways to secure the border between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. What exactly was that plan?
Well, the plan was the Saudi Arabian government were trying to establish some sort of security system that would make them feel that they were safe from any incursions from the Yemenis and also the Iranians, but mainly the Yemenis at this point in time. And of course the border between Saudi Arabia and the Yemen extends for 1,100 miles. It's a huge border. It's in a desert area. So there aren't, apart from the fact that it's a desert, there are no natural barriers like the Himalayas or great mountains or deep rivers. So in that sense, the Saudis are quite vulnerable from incursions across that border. So one of our missions was to try to give them the means by which they could survey the border and make sure that if there were incursions, they would be spotted by the Saudis, and they could do whatever they had to do to safeguard their security. But one of the ideas they came up with was burying system that allowed any movement of vehicles or troops across the border to be identified by vibrations in the ground. And when we looked at it, we thought we were not experts, but we thought, well, 1,100 miles of cable buried in the ground doesn't sound a feasible way of yeah. So the other thing we tried, which was not very successful, was testing a VHF surveillance cabin that was made specifically for the purpose of monitoring any incursion that happened where VHF radios were being used. So we sat for many long hours in the heat of the desert. My God, it was hot. Listening for signals that may or may not have been there, but that was very expensive system that didn't work.
And you were also saying, I mean, the net result of the year there was not hugely successful because of the uneducated nature of the Bedouin and the trying to find some mechanism to be able to monitor that border for movements of people or vehicles. But one of the other interesting things you told me earlier is that you had some competitors for the favours of the Saudis, which were the Chinese, and they were not too happy about the Brits being there. Expand a little bit on that for us.
Yeah, that was quite amusing, because when we got there, like I say, Jeddah was a very boring place. It was all concrete houses and no culture, office blocks, and not many people around. So we used to, at coffee break in the morning, we'd sit on the balcony and look out at a very uninteresting landscape, except that the offices opposite us on the other side of the road all seemed to be very interested in what we were doing. And they would sit on the balcony and look across, and then one or two or three people would come out, they would chat, they'd go back in again. And it wasn't until some months later that we realized that the Saudis had also brought in a group of Chinese technicians, experts, we assumed, in surveillance methods. And it sort of gave us quite a bit of background on what the Saudis were trying to do, and they're adept at that. I mean, they play off one country against another. They've been doing it very skillfully for a long time, just why the balance of power, the balance of diplomacy that they have between America and Britain and other countries that supply them with various things has endured for such a long period of time without any repercussions so far.
And fast forward, here we are in 2020, and much of what you've described is still a very, very live, if not more volatile, a debate. And I know that we'll pick up on more of that in the coming podcasts.
For sure, and the interesting thing about the Saudi social scene is that we picked that up even in 1979, is that there's a huge amount of discontent among Saudi people, because on the one hand they were subjected to a very strict form of Islam, which forbade them from drinking, which forbade them from various things, being in nightclubs and so on. But during the time, even 1979, we saw photographs that some of the soldiers that we were teaching had, showing the prince and even the king at one stage sitting in a nightclub in France with a bottle of wine in front of them. And of course, this dichotomy of behaviour that is apparent in countries like that can only lead to tension and ill feeling, and at some stage unrest in the countries that have that.
Yeah, and we're seeing some signs of change in Saudi Arabia. Women can now drive, and it's always been a very oppressive regime, and one that has caused its citizens a lot of heartache over the years.
Very much so. And now they're erecting on the Red Sea coast, not far from Jeddah. They've started building a complex for tourists, because the Red Sea is an incredible sea for snorkeling and diving and so on. And they're well ahead. They have to, because there's some point in the future where the supply of oil will disappear, and they have no real means of filling the gap. I mean, they can't, no agriculture to talk of, not much industry to talk of. So tourism seems the sensible thing to do.
And with all of that, oil diminishing, their power shifts as well. Exactly. As a result. So that volatility in the Middle East is not going to change, and we'll touch on some other country in future podcasts. One last thing to mention is quite amusing. So one of the things that happened while Dad was in Jeddah, one of the Bedouins that he was teaching decided that he wanted to marry me. And he'd never met me, but he wanted to marry me. And how many camels was he going to trade for me?
Yeah, he was offering 12 camels if he could marry Jane. Jane was very popular because the photographs I had, she had long blonde hair and so on. And although you were how old at the
30?
time? 30.
13.
Yeah, 13
yeah.
Rather. And yes, and he would, and I would say, "You're not serious, are you, Rabbi?" Yeah, I'm serious. Said, I'm serious. So we never did further the sight of.
Well, thank you for loving me enough not to send me to Saudi Arabia. I don't think I could have survived in that oppressive regime.
Oh my God! You can imagine entering a society like that was so strict. For a young, and of course they married quite young in Saudi Arabia. Not sure if 13. Yeah, I guess they would have done. So it wouldn't have been.
Thank you for not sending. Good job. I was well behaved, and you didn't want to send me to the other side of the world.
Absolutely, and it's not as if you can call 12 camels a disposable
asset. Yeah, what would you have done with 12 camels. in Taunton?
Exactly.
Well, thank you again, Dad. We're going to go off and make some lunch in a minute, and the next podcast I'm hoping will be really, really interesting, and it is going to take us actually physically back to somewhere that we lived. So my dad spent some time based in New Delhi in India in the late 60s, early 70s, when I was very young, and my sister Emma was born there. And so we're on the 14th of February 2020, we're heading back to Delhi for a week to retrace old stomping grounds, and the High Commission have very kindly said that they'll welcome us back to have a tour of the High Commission in New Delhi. So we're going to be recording some podcasts from India when the three of us go back to retrace our steps. So thank you very much.
Look forward to it.
Yeah,
Thank
me
you.
too. Thank you, Dad.